I think the main single point I want to emphasize is don't think about jobs, think about well-being, and think about what kind of well-being results from this technology. One of the things that should result from this technology is more leisure time and more time to do creative things that right now are not classified as compensated work. And that's good. And what we're interested in is well-being and the distribution of well-being. And those raise lots of complicated questions, but framing everything as the number of jobs is the wrong way to think about this. Now, let's go back. If we were the horses in 1900 and we saw the car coming, but the only difference to Eric's story is suppose the horses were in charge. Oh, I'm not even on. Okay. Thank you. Oh, an off switch. Okay. But you can't turn it off again. You have to listen to me for 20 minutes. Suppose we were the horses in 1900, but we were in charge. I think we could view this as a wonderful opportunity, not as a collapse, but for the chance for all of those new trucks and automobiles to carry the heavy loads, and we'd go to Central Park and graze all day. And maybe our jobs would go away, but if we owned the cars and the trucks, our well-being would certainly soar. And so the idea that a decline of the jobs is really the right metric is not appropriate for that little parable that Eric gave us. And I think it's not appropriate for this technology more generally. Probably the best starting point in the literature is 1920, and that's Chopik, R-U-R, Rossum's Universal Robots. Because his world was a world in which the robots did everything. And I think that's a good limiting condition for us to think about. Would that be a disastrous world? Would that be a good world? What kind of world would it be? Because if you guys are as good as I think you are, that's the kind of world that can evolve over time. And where the robots do a lot of the heavy lifting, as it were. And we have time as human beings to do other things that are not the drudge work that has been the fact of most of humanity for most of history, at least since the end of hunting and gathering 10,000 years ago and the advent of agriculture, which is a lot of drudgery and which is how most of humanity lived for most of our species' modern history. Now, for me, there have been three great trends of modern economic growth, which is roughly since 1800. And AI is not a break in that. It's a continuation, because we've had smarter and smarter machines for the last 200 years. And there have been three basic realities that have come from that. One is that the share of national income earned by capital has risen significantly over time. Sometimes we don't see that so starkly in the data because part of capital is human capital. It's the returns to the investment in skills. But if you add up the returns to the investment in skills plus the returns to physical capital and look at what's left over for raw labor, the share of the output that's going to raw labor has declined significantly and consistently for 200 years. That's likely to continue. In fact, one thing that AI might do is significantly shift the returns from human capital to physical capital, because the machines are going to do what smart people do right now or well-trained people do right now, and that will be an added shift, but it will be a shift within capital, and there will be a continuing shift away from labor. And I think that that is a 200-year trend that's going to continue. Second is people actually don't like to work hard physical labor. That's partly from introspection, I might say. But it also seems to be a general principle. And essentially, we used to work 20-hour work weeks about 40,000 to 10,000 years ago. in hunting and gathering, which by all estimates is not a very arduous job. Then came agriculture. Agriculture raised the work time to essentially year-round backbreaking labor. It's really tough. And for the next 9,800 years or so, I'm being a little bit facetious, but roughly that span, people worked all the time in physical daytime from the earliest morning till basically late in the evening, or when the sun went down and the lights went out, it was the end of the feasible workday. Very, very difficult work. And even you look in the United States in 1900, most workers were still manual labor, and they were working officially 70-hour work weeks, or women who were not formally in the labor force were working even harder at home with the fuel, with the water, with the clothing, with the sewing, with the very heavy physical labor as well on the farm. And that was life. Life was very, very hard work. I don't know about you, but I barely do any work in that sense. Most of my life is just consumption, like today. It's classified under a phony category called work. But I'm having the time of my life. I'm not breaking a sweat. What's my normal work day? I go to Starbucks. I meet somebody. I meet someone else at lunch. I have another meeting. This is work. They pay you for that, by the way. But not necessarily on a market basis, because I'm paid by a university, which is not a market-based institution. It gets money from taxes, and it gets money from philanthropy. I have no idea what my true market value is. My market value. That's not my human value, by the way. That's a big difference to think about the difference of a human value and a market value. They're very, very different things. My market value is less than my salary, in the sense that I'm funded by force, by taxes, or I'm funded by gifts. I'm not funded by the product I sell. But anyway, the point I was trying to make is that what I call work, or what's labeled for most of our work, is fun. And it's not hard, and it is not physical exertion, and it's a lot of leisure. And most of our time, people could only dream in other parts of the world where I work as a development economist of a life like this, because they are working round the clock to stay alive, to be able to have the funds to eat, to be able to have the funds to go to a doctor if they need it. Our lives are nothing like that. We're already in leisure, but it's categorized somewhat differently. But I'm going to show you some numbers about the amount of leisure that we have, and I think it's just going to continue. And the third, God, that's clever, an economist, 1, 2, and 2. There you go. You can take everything with that credibility afterwards. And that is the remarkable decline of manual labor in the economy. My guess from 1900, rough estimate, about 70% of the American labor force was working physical labor. That's farm labor, or carrying things, or stevedores, or construction workers, and now, or mining sector. Now it's well under 10%, arguably 6 or 7%. Construction is about 5%. Mining is a 0.5%. Agriculture, and by the way, today's farmers, most of them don't farm. They sit on their tractor. I recently talked to a farmer. He's got smart, autonomous tractor driving. He says, I still like to go sit on the tractor. I sit backwards. I watch the fields from behind. But the tractor does everything. It puts on the fertilizer. It puts in the seed. The physical labor is gone. Thank goodness. It's horrible, by the way. If you work in agricultural settings, people are breaking their backs trying to stay alive. And our farmers, who are less than 1% of our population now, have very little, most of them, or many of them, have very little physical labor. And of course, white collar, this is just up to 2000, 60%. We're roughly at 70, 75, 80% of what might be called clerical or sales. It's not all fancy jobs, but it's what's classified under white-collar work. On a given day, the average American adult, let's not even say adult, it's Americans over the age of 16, work 3 hours, 10 minutes. I find this thrilling and stunning, by the way. Our society is so productive that 3 hours, 10 minutes does it for $55,000 average per capita income. Can you imagine how good our technology is thanks to you and thanks to 2 centuries of advance? We can support the American economy with the average 16-plus-year-old working 3 hours, 10 minutes, as opposed to what probably was an average by this measure, 7.5, 8 hours. Maybe 80% of 16-plus worked in 1900. Very few retirees, most kids not at school. And now today, only 42% of 16-plus are at work on any given day. Because kids are in school, people are in retirement, people are on vacation or leave time, people are caregiving in their families. Of course, some are in incarceration, unfortunately, especially in the United States. A few are in unemployment. But basically, our society is so sophisticated that we can support an unimaginably high level of living. Us enjoying ourselves today, not breaking a sweat at all being flown in on someone's tab, having wonderful gala dinners, all of this stuff. We can support this with 3 hours, 10 minutes of work on average. And so I guess that work has declined by more than 50%. And if you count what I would say is real work, which is breaking a sweat, it's declined a lot more than 50% over the past century. And I mention all of this because AI is going to do this, is going to accelerate this fundamental underlying trend. So these are huge gains in well-being. That's the key point. However you score them on jobs, not jobs, leisure. But most of the discussion today has been, how are we going to find the jobs? We should think about how are we going to share the well-being so that other people can sit at wonderful conferences, have good snacks, have a gala dinner, talk about things that are interesting to them, maybe the baseball scores or something else, and do whatever they want to do and share that same amount of time. Meanwhile, the robots will be doing the work. And that's what we want. We don't think it's a tragedy that people aren't down in the mines anymore, as long as there's some way that they're also enjoying a good life. And for an economist, that's not hard to think about, because for me, we have a $20 trillion economy. And so if someone's not working, it just is a matter that Rex Tillerson really doesn't need $180 million severance pay. He could take a little bit less and let a miner have a day off. So if there's a little bit of distribution and humanity in our country, which admittedly may be the hardest problem of all, it's not so hard to share the well-being that's created by all this technology. But what I can tell you in history is every major technological change has expanded the pie and changed the income distribution both. And the idea that every major technological change lifts everybody is always wrong. It's never been like that. That's why the Luddites tried to smash the machines. And don't think that the cotton pickers were made better off by the cotton gin. They had to make a terrible, difficult migration north to try desperately to find jobs, especially being African Americans. It wasn't such a treat. They were hurt by the technological advance, though the overall size of the economy increased. What we forget in our country is distribution. We just hate the very idea of it, because we're mean, by the way, and because what's taken as ethics is Ayn Rand. come on. No, honest to God. Could we get out of 2nd grade? What is ethics? What I want to do. You know, really, for at least even the paleo ethics was much better than that. And so we've just got to grow up a little bit. We have no shortage of problems. We want the pie to expand. And then we face these problems. There will absolutely be unemployment of low-skilled workers. They will not all become computer programmers. And by the way, if you're doing your job, code will be written by code, not by you. If you guys don't put yourself out of the business, something is rotten, because the computers can write better code than you can eventually. And so it's not that everyone should be coder, for heaven's sake. I don't know how anything works that I'm dealing with anymore. I don't know how the PowerPoint works. I don't know how the computer works. I don't know how my phone works. I don't know how the plane flies. That's fine. I mean, I try a little bit, but not in any deep way. And I like that, being part of these technology systems that allow me not to have to do any work, get a paycheck, have good snacks all the time, and meet interesting people, which I take to be the end goal of all of this. Living in a good society with little work effort and plenty of time for our creative ideas, plenty of time for our humanity, and so on. I finally figured it out when we went to Virunga Park a couple of years ago to visit the gorillas. And there you see really what Eden was like, because Adam did not go to work in the morning. And the gorillas, by the way, they sit around all day. The food's right there. They have sex when they want. And the kids are kind of around, but you can shoo them away when you want to. And that's as close to Eden as I think we're going to get, actually. And AI could bring a lot of this along. So it's not how many jobs we can create, it's how much well-being we can really create. Now, the problems are there will be unemployment. They will not be compensated by becoming coders. There will be rising income inequality on a market basis, and I'll show you a few thoughts about that in a moment. And there are side effects, because that's not the kind of world that we actually evolved, even biologically, for. We're living in a very different world, so when we became sedentary, which is a good thing because we hate hard work, really. I think it's the biggest thing that humanity wants to escape is arduous physical labor. That's my observation from 40 years of being a development economist. It's a worldwide compulsion. I want to get out of agriculture if I can. But it's part of the obesity epidemic, for example. You have to recalibrate so that when you're not moving around, you're not eating as much. And this is not, this has been part of our unanticipated side effects. So what do we see? In macro data, we see now a declining share of labor. This is like the demand curve for raw labor shifting left, we would say. In other words, a decline at any given wage for the amount of workers. I think what Ray Kurzweil said this morning absolutely always has to be kept in mind, though. Any attempt to measure the well-being by the real income is as good as the estimate of the price level of the services that are being bought. And I'm convinced that we have an accelerated mismeasurement of services because of the economy because of this very large dematerialized service sector. So in this argument with Bob Gordon and so forth, are we really growing as slowly as the data show? I think absolutely not. We don't know how to measure any outputs anymore in the service sector. Outputs are measured by inputs. You absolutely don't measure productivity. How do you measure that everybody has GPS or everybody can call each other's friends or everybody can listen to as much music as they want or see a movie whenever they want it or any of that? None of that's in the price index. None of it. So we don't have any sense of the real well-being, but we do have sense of relative shifts. And raw labor is getting the raw deal, for sure, because Machines are smart, and they can do better what heavy lifting used to be able to do, but that's all good because heavy lifting is not fun for humanity. It's when we were cast out of Eden that the toil by the sweat of our brow started, not within Eden. So we don't want that. We want to be rid of it, but it does mean a turn of the income distribution. But I think it's much sharper than the official data show, because the official data show labor and capital. But labor has two pieces to it: the returns to skills and the returns to raw, heavy work. And the skills part we invest heavily in by many % of GDP in investment in education. So that's a return to capital, human capital, but our national accounts don't distinguish human capital, physical capital, and raw labor. If they did, I think it would look like this in 1900. This is made up data, just by me. But it's an eyeball, I just want you to know that. It's an eyeball heuristic, okay? So I think in 1900, but it's an educated guess, believe me, over-educated guess. In 1900, I'd say half of the national income was labor, half was physical capital, and quarter physical capital and a quarter was human capital. I'd say today, even though we say that roughly, 60% is labor, 40% is capital, of the part that is labor, maybe roughly half and half is human capital, raw labor. So the amount of raw labor has gone down from maybe 50% to 30% of national income. We're not done with the role of raw labor yet. And human capital and physical capital make up the difference, roughly. And so it's some picture like that. And I would say by 2050, it'll look something like this, which is the green is the raw labor, and the blue is a shrinking share of human capital because I'm counting on you to put me out of work. Because I actually believe that AI will be better economists than economists. Because it's really hard to track all the data. It's really hard to know what's happening in every labor market, in every microeconomy. It's impossible to read the 10,000 journals, except if you're artificial intelligence. So I'll be happy to help train a robot to put me out of work. I want my paycheck, though. So I'm coming back to that in a moment. But I think you could get better economic services, seriously, with fewer economists and better expert systems in the future. And I think that that's true of most human capital professions as well. And so the returns to income are going to be, I call it physical capital, but what I mean is the machines. I don't mean physical I mean physical plus software. I mean smart machines as being the red. And I think that that's the trend that is likely to continue. And if it went Chopek's way, it would be all red by the time that you have the really, really smart machines in the end. And that would be okay also, as long as the machines are doing what we want them to do to improve, to keep the quality of life, expand the pie, produce the food, help us with our transport and our mobility, have our virtual experiences, and essentially be able to sit in the coffee shop and meet friends all day, which again, to my mind, is the ultimate of happiness. So if you look at one sector where this is most advanced in manufacturing, of course, it's the automotive sector. And there, even in the official measurements of the shift towards capital, this is the labor share of income, which back in the late 80s was about 70% of the value added of the motor vehicle sector. And now it's under 45% of the motor vehicle sector. So, by the way, as many calls as Trump makes to God knows which automobile company, forget it. Are you kidding? So the plant that he just saved to Ford, it's a $700 million investment for 700 jobs, supposedly. And don't even expect all 700 jobs. That must be padded for the headlines. Who puts workers in auto factories anymore? Why would you? So that's what's showing here. These are production workers in this category of labor. These are all of the designers and other things that are working with CAD/CAM to produce the models, but the production workers are basically disappeared. And the other part of this, of course, is the soaring income at the top. There's a lot to be said about this, but the black line is the famous top 1% of Sachs and Piketty, and that's where we've seen this extraordinary rise of inequality. And basically what that is actually is capital income. That's the returns to capital, because capital is incredibly unequally owned. And so labor income is being degraded by technological change. As I keep saying, that's fine, as long as we redistribute the benefits. But of course, we're not redistributing the benefits. This is the joke of our politics. Greed trumps, if I could coin a phrase. Mr. Trump has appointed a cabinet of billionaires. And they're not thinking what we're thinking, by the way. They're thinking about how to cut the wealth tax, how to cut the estate tax, how to cut the corporate tax, how to cut every tax they can think of, because that's their mania, is to avoid any redistribution. That's the whole mania of America's insatiably greedy elite. And the technology is pushing us more and more in that direction. The tech is great because it's expanding the pie and making us able to live better. And if you're like us, because we're all in the top 1% basically, even if you don't know it, we are essentially. Our lives could not be more, at least I think, I don't mean on all your personal issues, but I mean on the economic issues. It's hard to imagine a better life. More secure, never breaking a sweat, having fun, doing what you want, and having plenty of leisure time under the category of work. So this is redounding remarkably to the very top of the income distribution. Now, as AI advances, the returns to human and physical capital will rise. I think because you're so good at what you're doing, the returns to capital, think of it financial, but I mean the ability to buy the robots and the AI systems, that will continue to rise. The returns to lots of human capital will fall. Lawyers will not make what they used to make. Radiologists may not exist in 20 years. What's a radiologist to do? I'm sure you can program these image readers to do a better job than the radiologists. Because what is radiology? It's pattern recognition. It's not some interpersonal contact. It's interpersonal contact with a piece of vinyl. So it's pure pattern recognition. So come on, everybody. Finish that. And then we won't have radiologists, which is okay. We don't need radiologists. We need the images read. And if you can do that, then anyone around the world will be able to put the image online, and within 5 minutes they'll be able to get a reading, whether they're in remote northern Uganda or in the Himalayas or in New York City. So this is a wonderful opportunity. And I think that that's true for, as I said, economics research. It's true for legal research, all the things that we heard about. But that doesn't mean that there are compensating jobs. It just means that there's higher well-being, a bigger pie. But you need redistribution. Because if you don't have redistribution, a few dominate everything, and then the rest suffer. So second, the returns to raw labor diminish. Third, the overall economy grows with disproportionate gains by capital owners and their children, because the huge transmission of capital is inter vivos, that parents take care of their kids. And so rich parents help their kids. I know my parents weren't rich, but they helped me. Without it, could not have done what I did. And my goal is to make sure that my kids can sit in a coffee shop the same way and enjoy themselves with the knowledge that I think is consumption knowledge, not all investment, but of course to contribute to society. But we'll see what that even means, because it might not mean through a job at all. So both bequests and inter vivos transfers mean that capital owners and their children are better off, and the big losers in society are the children of the poor and the working class. And the really sad part of this ridiculous election is that it's pure bait and switch, because those are the ones that Trump appealed to, and he's got the least conceivable interest or knowledge of their reality at all. And the policies that we're about to hear about are completely antithetical to what needs to be done. And the whole corporate establishment will rise up in huzzas saying how wonderful it is and what a genius that he's cutting the corporate tax rate, and thank God he's cutting the estate tax so that some farmer can pass along his farm. But what it really means is so that all the non-farmers billionaires can pass along their billions to their children, rather than to ensure a broad-based well-being in the society. So I do little finger exercises about this, asking conceptually, what does it mean to move to a Chopek-type economy where the robots do most of the work? And you can model that in a formal way in what economists call an overlapping generations framework, where every period is a generation, and there's young and there's old, and the young come into the world with their labor and maybe what mommy and daddy give them through bequests. And then they work, they save, and in their old age, they consume their wealth and they pass along some of their wealth to their children. And you get an overlapping generational framework that Paul Samuelson invented back in 1957. And if in that framework you put in robots, and in period 3, you realize that by period 4, the robots are going to have a technological boom. And you ask, what happens in this society? And in my little society, I have a few rich households, and I have a lot of working class households. The working class households don't give bequests, and they don't inherit bequests. The rich have bequests, and they pass along intergenerationally those bequests. And what happens in period 3 is that you realize that by period 4, the robots are going to be much more productive. The pie is going to be bigger, but for that one generation, but the returns to labor, the wages, are going to go down. And so if you're a poor 4th generation, you start getting hit because your wages go down. But if you're a rich kid, it's not bequests, it's bequests. If you're a rich kid in generation 4, your parents have scored it rich because their savings have been multiplied by a booming stock market. Call it Dow 20,000. And because of the returns to capital, they're okay. They're going to get a capital receipt. Either it could be education, it could be a transfer of financial wealth, but the rich kids are going to be helped by their parents, whereas the poor kids are just going to suffer a decline of wages. Well, in this little particular simulation, the boost from robotics revolution is good enough to enable the poor to have some little level of bequests. They help their kids for a couple of generations, but eventually the utility of the poor children ends up lower than before the robotics revolution. So the poor households are absolutely immiserized compared to where they were before AI came along. There are no longer bequests because they're just so poor. Whereas the rich end up permanently better off. Because while each young generation comes in and it can't sell its labor anymore because the wages are reduced, every generation receives a transfer payment from the rich parents. And that goes on intergenerationally ad infinitum. So bottom line, in order for all parts of society to benefit from advancing technologies, We need to tax the capital owners and redistribute the earnings to the young through free tuition for skill training or tax credits, say, for low-wage workers. Without such transfers, income inequality will rise and large parts of society will be immiserized. So unless we have capital transfers, even though the pie is expanded, a significant part, that part which sells its raw labor or which cannot finance human capital out of its own income levels, will be hard hit. Let me stop there with that issue and just raise three more issues that have seemed to me to be important for the discussion here. This is just a final slide based on this morning's discussion. You are the AI epistemic community from a sociological point of view. And that means you are the expert community that has responsibility for communicating your field to society. So I would say that's your social role and your sociological role. You're the AI epistemic community. A lot of the discussion's wonderful, and the goal of beneficial AI is fantastic. But I think it misses three things that I would like to add. One is the ethics discussion should be about AI ethics in an unethical world, not just in a perfect world. I'm a development practitioner and a policy guy. The world is so nasty, you can't even believe it. It's corrupt, it's nasty, people are left to die. It's horrible. That's humanity, by the way. Welcome to humanity. Robots can do better. But the point is that you have to think about all the misuses of the technology, of course, and all I'm saying is that some commandments aren't going to solve the problem of the real unethical nature of the world. So you have an advocacy role that's more than just making a list of good things, because the world isn't there to receive your good things. The world's nasty. That's number one. Second, human behaviors are not human values. You cannot train robots for ethical behavior based on observed human behavior. This is a big mistake, I think, from this morning's discussion. I really don't agree with Stuart Russell on this. Values are not observed behaviors. 2,500 years of ethical teaching in the East and the West is all about the difference of human behavior and human values. And most ethical teachings are about the hard struggle for each of us to be good. And so there's a difference of what we do and what we want to do and what we think to be the good. There's only one field that really screwed this up badly, and that's economics. Because economics, starting in the 19th century, said what you observe is the good, because just take preferences as given. This is almost insane from the point of view of everything we know about psychology and ethics. But don't listen to economists, except me. Don't listen to economists about values. Revealed preference is maybe useful for something about estimating a market demand curve, but it's useless in terms of trying to infer values for AI. And so that's my third point. What's fascinating for me is that your challenge actually can help to reinvent moral thinking, to re-energize moral thinking. Now, there's a world of great moral thinking. Again, my favorite activity in life is sitting at a coffee shop, and sometimes with other people, but mainly reading Aristotle. That's my true heaven. Because it's just a joy to read a brilliant thinker talk about the human good. It gives me a physical high to do that. There's so much good learning to incorporate. Don't just observe behavior. Let's get the ethicists deeply engaged in this activity. Because and I'll just stop here. I used to go on and on about how stupid the trolley problem is. Because I said, my God, how long can these ethicists worry about this stupid artificial problem with so many real important things to worry about in the world? But you know what? The trolley problem's really about a trolley, it turns out. Because you've got to program the self-driving vehicles. So it's actually an important problem. Thank you.